Hello and welcome to the Property Lifestyle Mastery podcast. I'm Jackie Tomes, and on this show we are having open and honest conversations about building a property business that doesn't just create cash flow, but it also creates freedom from those that have been there and done it. So myself and Dave have gone from zero to over £17 million of deals done, and we're mostly known from going on holiday every 6 weeks. So whatever freedom means to you, this show is all about empowering you and giving you the tools and knowledge and inspiration to go out and make it happen. And on today's show, we are joined by the incredible Dillon Dhanecha, who I have saved until this part of the journey of the show because I really wanted him to be able to lay it all out there in terms of the depth of his experience. And I feel like now is an amazing time to be able to do that. So Dillon's got an incredible background as a trader, an award-winning trader, but he's also a property investor. He invests in social housing, and he is such an incredible spiritual teacher as well. And today we're talking really about abundance, and it leads on so nicely last week from that conversation with Dave and Dom around manifesting your ideal vision. So Dillon's taking that even further and down the lens particularly of abundance, how you can create more abundance in your life, and using, of course, property investing as the tool. So without further ado, here is Dave and Dillon.
Hello, Dillon. So nice to have you on the podcast with us. So Dillon here, for everyone listening, is such a wonderful man, and he is a spiritual teacher. He is a retired award-winning trader, and he's also a social housing investor in property, helping asylum seekers and refugees. He really hits every button for me of like what we aspire to be in the world. Like, he's just a genuinely gorgeous human being, and I really hope you get that from him today. Yeah, fanning himself there. Sorry, Dillon. But I think you, Dillon, really show the breadth of like just how much you can learn in one lifetime about so many different things, and then bring all that knowledge back to something really powerful, such as like increasing your happiness levels alongside being abundant, alongside being wealthy, alongside helping other people and serving the world, serving and helping. You know, it's just a wonderful package you bring together that I think is so supportive for humanity. So yeah, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, dude, thank you so much indeed. Beautiful, beautiful words there. I'm very grateful to be here. Very grateful to be here.
So it's a pleasure to have you. And I think we're going to start today's podcast just talking about what is so hard about making money. Why is it so hard to make money? And I know you've got lots of ideas on that, and that's going to be the starting point of our conversation. So, and then let's just see where the conversation goes from there, because that can go a lot of different ways. So yeah, Dillon, I ask you, why is it so hard to make money for us human beings, us mere mortals on planet Earth?
So fundamentally, and I guess that comes from this perspective that we're all told it's easy to make money, but in practice, it is actually really difficult to move from a stage where you are maybe deep in debt, or even kind of struggling to break through a glass ceiling. You don't have to be in debt, but just struggling to get to that next level from, you know, from debt to even Stevens, from even Stevens to cash in the bank, from cash in the bank to more cash in the bank, from more cash in the bank to actually having assets and net worth and passive income from assets, and from there to leaving an actual legacy for your future generations. So actually, you know, whatever level you're at, whatever stage you're at on this financial journey, it is in practice really difficult to break through those glass ceilings. And fundamentally, it's down to the definition of economics. As I remember being told on my very first day as an economics undergraduate, I remember being told the definition of the economy. The economy is designed around it's the function of the allocation of scarce resources, the efficient allocation of scarce resources. That's the economy. I just couldn't get my head around this idea that we've designed something to allocate scarce resources efficiently, and that then goes on to supply and demand and all this other, you know, economics stuff, money supply, M1, M2, blah, 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 you know, inflation, interest rates. The whole thing is designed around the fundamental premise that we are efficiently allocating scarce resources, and that we are rational players efficiently allocating scarce resources. The two things didn't make sense to me. Number one, resources are not scarce. Water, food, land, like it's just raw materials. All the work I did, on the African continent shows me that the resources are definitely not scarce.
Yeah.
That's the first thing I didn't quite understand. Bearing in mind, I was at a university where all of my peers had jobs in the square mile before they'd even set foot in university. All their dads were partners, senior partners, CEOs of hedge funds, etc., 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 etc. These guys had jobs in big city firms. They didn't even need to be at university. So, and I'd never even studied economics. I went to a comprehensive that didn't even have economics as an A level. So I'm coming at this really fresh. That's the first thing I didn't get. Resources are not scarce. The distribution might be skewed, but the resources itself.
Yeah.
The second thing I didn't quite understand, which has since been proven by people like Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize winner, who wrote the book Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, and his peers. There's another book, Predictably Irrational, which is a fantastic book on behavioral economics. The second thing I didn't quite understand is that human beings are definitely not rational. I'm 18 years old at this time. So I'm very wet behind the ears on this, but they're the two things that didn't make sense to me. Resources are not scarce, and human beings are not rational in any way, shape, or form, particularly in financial decisions. Now, I grew up in a household where, my parents are refugees, so money was scarce, and I did have a refugee money mindset, but even that was kind of almost alien to me because in my heart, it was like, why am I living like this? Why am I thinking like this? But actually, in my heart, I fundamentally believe that resources aren't scarce and we're not rational human beings. I remember writing to Santa Claus at 6 years old, 1984, in fact, when the Ethiopian famine appeal was on. I rewrote my letter to Santa Claus, that list of 20 things I'd asked for, the rally burner, the BMX, the this, the that, and the other. Actually, can you not bring them to me? Can you send them to the children in Ethiopia? What I thought starving children in Ethiopia would ever want with a BMX and a rally burner, I'm not sure. But anyway, and that shows this, I guess, this fundamental belief that, I don't have it, I really want it, but yet I'm okay giving it away. My mother always taught me to be the conduit of wealth, the conduit of wisdom, the conduit of kindness and compassion. So fundamentally, why it's so hard to make money is because we are conditioned to be rooted in scarcity and survival. And of course, we are wired, evolutionarily, we're wired to be in scarcity and survival. And so we've kind of got this economic infrastructure around us that keeps us locked in survival and scarcity thinking because the whole thing is designed around scarcity and survival.
Yeah.
We often say, don't we, the value of your house didn't double in 10 years. The value of your money halved in 10 years. And these are the economic realities. And so you start looking at this idea of survival and scarcity, and you link that to, the seven energy systems in the body. You link that to things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, so the modern stuff and the ancient stuff. You link that to high beta brain waves. You link that to adrenaline, cortisol, the endocrine system. And you start seeing that when you are consumed by not just survival and scarcity thinking, but the biophysics of survival and scarcity, the neurology of survival and scarcity, the yogic science of survival and scarcity, when all of your being is rooted and operating from a place that is either fearful of not having enough or fearful of losing what you do have, and with an inability to think rationally and an inability to think in probabilities, we find it very difficult to think in probabilities. All of that means that we're trying to play the game of money, but we're playing it through, which is a game of fear and greed. And we're trying to play it through the filter of fear and greed. And for sure, there are some people who do very, very well. But the people who do really well, as you and I both know, in 8.3 billion people on the planet, the people who do it really well, we refer to them as the top 1%.
Yeah.
So, yes, it can be done through a filter of fear and greed. But what I've seen in the main is the people who have got a view on oneness and unity and humanity and a care and a compassion for people, planet, flora, and fauna, the people that really want to go out there and serve, actually find it difficult to play that game of fear and greed. So what we have to do is to start looking at rewiring ourselves away from survival, away from scarcity thinking, and towards, as fluffy as it sounds, towards an abundance consciousness, towards an understanding that even if you write a letter to Santa Claus with 10 gifts that you really want on it, and you want it all because you've grown up in a refugee household, so you want 10 presents, actually, you can give them away because they'll come round another time. This idea that, can you play the game of fear and greed with a different filter, and a filter of abundance consciousness, and also can you play the game of fear and greed without becoming a product of that game? And that's the other reason people find it so hard. And it's just not just people, me too in the past, is because you almost don't want to become a product of the game. You want the trinkets of the game. You want to play the game, but you don't want to play it in the way that you see others playing it that are winning. And you don't want to play it in a way that it creates you as a product of that game. You become a product of fear and greed. But the alternative is that you stay stuck in scarcity, you stay stuck in survival, and you're a product of the game of fear and greed. It just so happens you don't have the trinket. So yeah, I guess a kind of slightly meandering answer to this seems like a simple question. Why is it so hard to make money? There's plenty out there to make.
Yeah.
And you only need a tiny percentage of what's out there in order to have a radically different life. If I look at what we're blessed with right now, it's a tiny, incremental, insignificant fraction of the money supply that's out there. But it has radically changed our lives, from returning from Rwanda, £106,000 in debt, to being in a place that we're at right now. It's a tiny fraction.
Yeah.
It's so hard to acquire that, or rewire yourself in a way that you can acquire that.
Yeah. So I was going to say, one thing that really I'd love to know more of your thoughts on is we talk about the place of survival and fear and greed, and that's, you've clearly identified that as how the money game is played, and it's actually the hard way to play the game. But why is it? Because why is it that fear and greed is so hard to therefore be abundant? Well, what is it that causes that disconnect between success, wealth, success, and fear and greed being a bad route? Like, why are they clashing?
So, I think fundamentally, you've kind of got this thing, the mind, and that's the bit that we've been working on for so long. It was Seligman that kind of created the movement for positive psychology back in 2000. And since the year 2000, we've really been working on, positive psychology, positive thinking. And when you think about that in the money space, abundance affirmations and mind movies and vision boards and, deservedness and, all these other cool things. You're making a plan and going for it and getting trained and, all these things. The money's out there, the properties are out there, the ventures are out there. And this kind of using the mind to help you to think abundantly, to help you escape the fear and greed programming, and trying to have the body and the brain follow the mind. But actually what we have is a mind that's hugely fallible, a mind that has been corrupted by kind of the nurture that we received. If you believe in this kind of expansive version of the timeline, it might not just be your younger years, but it might actually be a past life. So there's some ancestral stuff going on there as well, depending on how far you want to look back. But certainly throughout the course of our lives, we've been corrupted in our money mindset, in our poverty mindset. That's the thing we're trying to overcome. And previous generations are responsible for that. My mum and dad weren't born with a particular mindset. The refugee experience certainly changed their mindset a little bit, but they weren't born with that. I now know I commissioned a biography for my dad and his story. And it turns out that there are so many interesting events that happened in his past and my grandfather's past that now begin to help me understand why he thinks in the way that he does. A ridiculously smart man, and has done, immensely well for us as a family. but has done it the hard way, has done it through fear, not greed, but certainly fear, fear of not having enough, fear of losing it all, making really, and he's an accountant as well. So that adds to this kind of prudence around his spending and his investing. And so the fear leads to an inability to take risks. Things are kind of black and white. And so when you try and work on the mindset of money, actually you've got the weakest component of mind, body, brain, but it's also the loudest part of the mind, body, and brain. So you've got something that's inherently weak, inherently corrupt, inherently fallible, that we're trying to fix. We were using mindset work on the mind to try and fix the mind. So you're using a broken mind to try and fix itself, and it just doesn't work long term, which is one of the reasons it's so hard to escape fear and greed mentality kind of for long enough to make the difference, for long enough to see those step changes in our financial reality. Whereas and this is kind of the entry point that we come in at this from a kind of a neurological perspective and a biophysical yogic perspective. The body and the brain are such powerful tools at our disposal and the mind follows the body, follows the brain, follows the mind, follows the body, follows the brain. The three of them play like a follow my leader. It needs one to lead and the other two will fall in line. And at the moment, we've got this weak, fallible mind shouting the loudest. So the body and the brain are falling in line. Our job is to get the body and the brain leading and just let the mind follow, essentially. And so the detachment of fear and greed is not because we want to be fearful and we want to be greedy, but it's just that we can't help but be fearful and or greedy. And the two don't always go hand in hand. It's kind of one or the other or both. But it's actually really difficult to escape fear. It's become almost like a mental addiction to be fearful. And those neural pathways, the neural pathways for essentially fear are so deeply entrenched that we have become resonant to fearful messages. We've become resonant to the risk of doing something. And sometimes we wrap that up in this idea that it's prudent. There's a function of the brain, it's called the frequency following response, the FFR. And the frequency following response is the part of the brain or the neurological function of the brain that essentially, think about it like an antennae. And this antennae picks up on a frequency, an external frequency, and plays follow my leader with that frequency. So, for example, if you are, well, actually, let's take a real life example. So, 2020, even the most evolved human beings in the very, very early stages of March 2020, even the most evolved human beings were very susceptible to falling into a fearful state. Until about 3 or 4 days into it, or a week into it, or 2 weeks into it, it just didn't feel comfortable. And it didn't really, none of it made sense. And we kind of went back to our more evolved, enlightened way of looking at the world and questioning what's going on. But essentially, the reason we find it so easy to fall into fear is because, number one, we're wired for it. From an evolutionary perspective. But number two, the frequency following response has been over millennia, has been now conditioned to pick up very quickly on the fear frequency. And the fear frequency in brainwave terms is the high beta frequency. It's stress, it's anxiety, useful for a fight, flight, freeze situation, but not very, very useful in the normal course of life. And so our job from a neurological perspective is to retune the frequency following response, to get it familiar with the other four brain waves, alpha, beta, delta, gamma. And once you do that, you develop a perception, a sensory perception for this non-sensory function. Essentially, you start to feel what alpha feels like, what gamma feels like, what delta feels like. And you can then put the brain into those states without the external stimulus. Once you do that, now you start operating in flow. Now you start operating through insight and intuition and wisdom, which in yogic terms are the upper energy centers, not through fear and greed, which are the lower energy centers. So the link is simple and complex at the same time.
Right, brilliant, Dylan. I was going to jump on one thing you said earlier, just for the audience. There is a fantastic book. If you're not sure about understanding of ancestral trauma and how that impacts us in our present day, there's a fantastic book called It Didn't Start With You. I can't remember who the author is, but it really puts a very clear picture of just how impacted we are, like from before we're born, even from our grandmother being affected by her grandmother, that trauma is actually already impacting her womb and impacting what's going to happen when she has her baby, and that becomes you, the next baby along. It's really good for getting your head around that idea, because it's so much more impact than we ever imagine. You think of it as just, well, I have DNA, and that DNA was passed down from my mum and dad, and they kind of joined, and it must be my DNA. It's not just the DNA. There is so much more going on there. So that's a fantastic book for that. Next thing I was going to jump on was, you've talked a lot there about frequency. And I know, Dylan, you kind of pieced it all together for yourself, and for when you've got more time to spend with people, you've got this incredible picture of how it all goes together. But I wanted to just understand from your perspective, we've got the neurological hardware, which I agree, it's amazing that this is habitual formation of how the automatic patterns happen in the brain, and that those are therefore responding very, very strongly, and they are generally a lot of fear response systems that are happening there. The hardwiring of the brain is pretty much based on a lot of fear response systems, and you're kind of born with those, and then they just get strengthened during your birth. That all makes sense, and then that informs your brain waves, which again, another thing for listener here is, if you want to know more about brainwave frequency, I'd suggest a guy called Joe Dispenza looking into his stuff, because he makes it very easy to understand the difference between the different brainwave frequencies and how you evolve over time, and how, as you evolve, what frequency comes into play, and then how they interact and affect your life. And the beta brainwave frequency being how we are when we're in standard, making sense of the world, concentrating level. And what, Dylan, you just spoke about was the really high brainwave frequency of stress, which is also beta, but it's high beta, and that we all as a humanity, as a human race, spend far too much time in that high beta brainwave. So that's a brainwave frequency. So that's what's going on in the brain. Can you just kind of elaborate a little bit more on what does frequency mean to you? And when you're saying that we're receiving frequency, what is that scientifically? Obviously, I know what emotions are going on, but you keep talking about frequencies and energy, and that is an energy, a frequency. So yeah, can you elaborate a bit more on that, just so I understand it, or the audience understands it, the
Sure.
interrelation between frequency and emotion and body? Yeah.
Think about it. One of the ways I love thinking about it, a couple of ways to think about it. One of the ways to think about it is, you could walk into a funeral with your eyes closed, and you would experience a palpable sense of sadness and grief. There would be something there. You would feel it. You'd experience it. You might not be able to put your finger on it, but it would be there. In the same way that you walk into a darkened room for somebody's surprise birthday party, and there's a palpable sense of anticipation and excitement. You're sitting in a church, before the bride walks in, and you close your eyes and just sit there for a second and feel the energy. There's a palpable sense of excitement, of optimism, of love in the air. And so essentially, yes, it's electrical currents, it's radio waves, it's the whole lot. But ultimately, what it really is an impact on how you feel, and from there, how you perceive the world around you. And if you think about this from a money perspective,
Yep.
if we are conditioned to be fearful of our financial future, i.e., not having enough to retire, which is what all of our programming is based upon, is, will we have enough to retire? From the very earliest days, will we have enough to retire? What's actually happening is that when you are making a financial decision, you are naturally disposed to making that decision not to lose, rather than to win. And they're two very different things. Making a financial decision not to lose is very different to making a financial decision to win. So are we playing the game not to lose, or are we playing the game to win? And sometimes inadvertently, we mistake playing to lose with prudence and with financial diligence. And we look at people who are playing to win as maybe reckless. And certainly those people who are, when we even refer to it as gambling big, we refer to it as, he put his farm on the line, whatever, right? And so our job is to almost understand what's happening, understand that there is an energy in the economy that is fundamentally the energy of fear of losing it all, or fear of not having enough. These are the fears, the energies that drive the economy. If you think about how people spend money, even from a physical perspective, that money is infused with fear, it's infused with greed. If it's been up somebody's nose, it's infused with germs, but the whole game is infused with an energy of fear, not having enough, fear of losing it all. And so when you start playing this game, even if you come into it abundant and optimistic, you're going to start hearing things. You're going to start picking up on things. You're going to start reading financial press. You're going to start worrying about whether this investment that you're going into now, will it really turn out to be what it needs to be in the next 10 years, the next 20 years? You start doubting messages. You start feeling like you're too late. So you start regretting past decisions. I didn't get in enough. That leads to then an immediate fear of the future. That leads to a present moment frustration. So you've got regret, fear, and frustration. And so if you come at it from this perspective, that regret, fear, and frustration puts you into that high beta brainwave state. It also locks your energetic response to the world in your lower 3 energy centers from a yogic science perspective, which are your survival centers. And so you start manifesting from fear. You start making decisions through fear. And that is really how the kind of the frequencies and the energies work. You can pick up on what's happening in the air. That's the way that the frequency following response is designed. You can feel the fear. That impacts how you feel. How you feel impacts how you perceive the world. How you perceive the world impacts how you make decisions around the world. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You make decisions based in fear. That creates results that were rooted in fear. And then it's almost like, well, I told you so. I told you it wouldn't work. And the flip side of that is to move from a high beta brainwave. And this is where kind of I love what Dr. Joe's done. And I love that we're able now to build on the work of these kind of older legends, because what we now have is an understanding of the gamma brainwave. We're beginning to understand the psi brainwave, which is 100 hertz plus. Our job, first and foremost, is to move from a high beta brainwave to an alpha state, which is grounded, centered. Once you're in an alpha state, from there, everything else opens up. And from that place, you can start then slowing down. So you can move into a meditative theta state where you have access to your subconscious. You can start rewriting your subconscious beliefs. So one of the reasons, for example, affirmations don't work is because generally when we're using affirmations, I'm wealthy, I'm wealthy, I'm wealthy, it's happening, it's happening, it's happening, the money's on its way, the money's on its way, etc. I can. Usually we use those affirmations in a state of anxiety and fear and worry, and we're not in a grounded, centered state, and we're certainly not in a theta state where we've got access to our subconscious. So the affirmations might work temporarily because the words make you feel good. That's mindset work. But what we're not doing is doing the deep energetic work of rewriting the subconscious in a theta. You can drop lower down into a delta wave. And the delta wave is the slowest wave of them all. There is one slower, which is almost flat, which is lambda. But in conventional functional terms, the delta wave is the slowest. And the delta wave is that deep restorative, what I call a reconciliatory wave. Usually happens when you're in deep sleep, although we can induce it with, things like this. This device is a magnetic resonance device. So we use this across our tribe at our events to induce specific states. And the deep wave delta is what is going to allow you to reconcile, memory into wisdom, experiences into learnings. That regret that we have of the past, when you are in a deep wave delta, the brain will automatically categorize those experiences not into a file that says regrets and mistakes, but actually into a form of wisdom, into a form of learning, into a form of kind of positive fuel, if you like. Yeah. Say, okay, like, yeah, that was a bad decision, but it's not going to stop me from making that decision again. For property, we all have, those property investments that we thought, if only I hadn't done that.
Yeah.
And for some of us, we'll move beyond that and we'll take the learning from that. And likelihood is we won't make the same mistake again, but we'll certainly take the learning from that. For others, I know people who suffered in the 2008 crash that still have not got back into property because they lost so much money in that 2008 crash that they've just not ventured in. And yet on the flip side, I know people that had a hard time in 2008 and have come back and done really, really well. So what's the difference that makes the difference? It is an ability to control how you feel, how you perceive, and how you make decisions from an alpha-centered state, or how you rewrite your subconscious beliefs in a theta state, how you reconcile past regrets in a delta state, how you focus on the present moment, i.e. in the functional work, in an optimal beta state. And then from a gamma state, which is the highest brainwave that we can measure at the moment. Like I said, we're exploring psi, but gamma is the latest brainwave to be discovered in about, or heavily researched only from the 80s onwards. And the gamma brainwave is the brainwave that we see when we put Tibetan monks on an EEG, for example. And essentially, a gamma brainwave is where you are firing on all cylinders. You've got complete mind, body, brain, heart coherence. All centers of the brain are talking to each other. From a Vedic perspective, the gamma brainwave opens the crown energy center, the crown chakra, and that allows you to receive insight and inspiration and wisdom. We talked a second ago about how if you're rooted in fear, you're manifesting from the survival centers upwards. You're manifesting from fear, pushing rock up a hill. Like you said, you're doing things the really hard way. But when you activate the gamma brainwave and your crown chakra, and you can activate the crown chakra through its resonant frequency as well. We can talk about that in a second, but coming at it from a neurological perspective, you activate the crown chakra from a gamma brainwave, and now you manifest from the top down. You receive insight. That insight, inspiration, turns into intent in your third eye and your throat. That then moves from intention to attention in the heart chakra. And as you start kind of focusing on these two things, intention and attention, the idea that started off as a wispy little form of inspiration, you thought you wanted to do something and you either let that go because you're fearful immediately that it's not for you, or you grab a hold of it and you hold on to it long enough. You speak your truth about it through the throat. You start to own that idea in your heart. Intention, attention, intention, attention. And then as you get down to your lower three energy centers, these stop being centers of fear and start being centers of creation. So your solar plexus, your sacral, and your root start being the centers through which now you can take aligned action with an expectation of success and actually realize that wispy inspirational idea into a material reality. And each of the brainwaves is linked to the energy centers, and the energy centers are located essentially on the spinal column. They're linked to the endocrine system, so they then link back to, for example, how your throat produces specific thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, how your root chakra produces certain survival hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, etc. So the whole thing is linked, and the whole thing is so much more powerful. The neuro-yogic approach is so much more powerful than the psychological approach. And we know how hard it is to reprogram the mind. I mean, it's infinitely impossible to reprogram the mind permanently. We just have to have different leaders, and the leaders are brain and body.
Fantastic. Oh, God, so much there, Dillon. It's unbelievable. Everything you're saying, It's so spot on. I'm just going to add a couple of items just for the listeners, because I know a lot of people listening might not be on board with the chakra systems, as it were, the concept of the energy sense in the body. And I just wanted to confirm for everyone listening that this is 100% scientifically researched. There are literally machines that can measure this. Dr. Joe Dispenza was the person who really showed this to me in his research, and he's literally built with scientists the machines to monitor the chakras, monitor the energy systems, and monitor how meditation and things that you do just inside your head can shift and adjust those centers and literally see the changes in them. So yes, the old yogic science of yoga, it is a science. The science of yoga has been proven with modern day science, and it is massively, it makes such an impact. It's impactful in how you can use your body. Next thing I was going to say was I love this concept. You're basically saying we are currently in a state of fear. You are being controlled by the body, and your actions being controlled by like the fear of the mind. And so in other words, you are totally beholden to the world, pretty much beholden to what's going on, and just reacting accordingly. And what you're pretty much I'm getting for you, Dillon, is it's time for us to learn how to change gears in the car of our body, to say enough's enough. I want to choose how I feel. I want to choose what brainwave I'm in. I want to be able to choose how I react and respond. I want to choose my emotion. I want to choose everything to be optimized, to be optimum. And so that when something happens, whatever it might be, the 2008 crash or someone dies nearby, that I actually am going to have some sort of a reaction to that. The world is going to impact me, but that I'm not going to then just allow that to rule my life for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, that actually there is an emotional process, a journey I need to go through, and how can I help myself to move through that as quickly as possible. And there is just so much out there to teach you about this, right? And you've already you're just talking about it like it's just normal second nature, but I know that everything you're saying comes from so many different sources. It's ridiculous. And again, another one for people who might be more scientifically minded, if you want to understand a bit more, Dylan's talked a lot about yoga and the yogic interaction with modern neuroscience, and I think Dean Radin is a fantastic scientist who has literally wrote a book called Supernormal, and I thought that was a great introduction for people into how modern day science is showing what the ancient yogic superpowers were and how they actually can be manifest in current day life, and that actually you have these superpowers inside of you if you so choose to go down the route of trying to use them. They are there, and they are being monitored, and they're being scientifically proven. And Dean Radin, I think, is a wonderful proponent of that side of the push for science to actually get into this world, and actually show like what's possible. So here we are. We've got yogic chakras. We've got the ability to shift our brain waves. We've got neuroscience. All of these are pretty much tools that you've talked about here, Dylan. So I guess every single one of these tools is a method to help you to become more able to be abundant and to manifest. And I guess we hint the rules of this is pretty much the basis, the fundamentals of the rules of the law of reciprocity or the law of attraction or all of these things that people talk about. But there's no like basis. When people talk about them, they say, oh yeah, the law of attraction. They don't kind of give you an explanation of why that is, like what you're actually doing, how do you utilize it. It's just, I think that program called The Secret really, it was a phenomenon, a worldwide phenomenon, but it pissed me off so much. Because I was like, oh great, you're just basically going to sit there saying, yeah, there's this law, this rule, as it were, that you can use, and here's everything you can get from it, but nothing else. There was nothing else to it. And from my perspective, what you've just discussed here, everything you've said, that's what it's based on. The world works on separate rules that are not the fear response system, that are not the fear and greed route that humanity's rational mind has decided is the be-all and end-all, because that's based on survival and that's what the human body wants. You're saying there's another set of rules that we can access, and particularly access when you talk about things like the gamma brainwave. I know that is the brainwave that, for example, if someone, a huge spiritual person goes into a form of revelation, Christianity talks about revelation. That's why we have literally a chunk of the Bible called Revelation. It's because that's literally talking about what happens when you connect to something greater than yourself. And at that point of like literally spiritual revelation is usually it's connected with the gamma brainwave because you're connecting with something higher, and that has been proven as well. That's been monitored and measured, and that moment of being in that brainwave, we can see like people literally not just become cohesive, but they can heal. Spontaneous healings happen in that same place, bodily healings, or sudden insights into just literally curing their mental restrictions from the past, traumas from the past, are suddenly cured because it suddenly becomes clear to them the perspective shift, and they see them with a new perspective what it was, and they put it in the past, like you've just said, put it in the past in a wonderful way that is now experience and wisdom rather than trauma and stuckness. So, Dillon, it's enough from me because I want to just hear, you've talked about so many things, and what is your suggestion for anyone listening? You want to become more abundant, you want to shift yourself away from your fear response system and become less of what I call a self-saboteur, human self-saboteur, just allowing the natural response of the body to control you and basically sabotage your everyday actions. We want to move from that, and we want to become abundant and manifesting and wealthy, right? And we want to be able to attract the money to us in a way that feels good. Because I think something you said at the very beginning really hit home with me, and it's that feeling of you stop. Because one of the self-sabotage mechanisms is seeing how other people make money, and you associate that with therefore something you don't want. You don't want to be greedy. You don't want to be like that, and you pretty much set barriers for yourself. You know, you've hardwired in barriers for like why you shouldn't make money rather than why you should. And so, what are your suggestions? How do we use neurology, yogic science, and all of these other things, chakras, energy, meditation, brainwaves, to get ourselves to a better place where we can actually make money?
So, if you think about it from, I don't know if we mentioned this, we've talked about it so much, but Tesla talked about, if you want to understand the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. If you apply that to money specifically, which is kind of my area, MONEY, money is defined as my own natural energy yield. So the one thing we focus on, two things we focus on. Number one is the my. So it's very much an inward looking process rather than an outward looking process. And then the yield of energy that you have to put out there in the world. So we are electromagnetic beings. The way the law of attraction, so I love all of that stuff because it was just such strong foundations for us to come and build on with that scientific understanding. We're electromagnetic beings, and the idea of attraction is that you would attract opportunity to you. In the same way that you might think of finding a parking space and you find one, you might think of a song on the radio and it comes on. You might think of somebody and they actually call you and, oh, I was just thinking about you. How weird is that? So that is you as an electromagnetic field having an influence on the material world. So our primary sole job really is to increase the effect of our electromagnetic field. How do you do that? Number one, you move energy from the lower centers to the higher centers. So you actually start, and we do a practice at our one-day retreat, the two-day retreat, and even on some of the online classes, we do a breathing practice that draws energy from the root, from the base of the spine, up through the solar plexus, which is the seat of self-worth and confidence. This is where people have a big blockage, is in that seat of self-confidence. Why a lot of people experience abdominal issues, microbiome imbalances, is because we've got so much stagnant energy that's locked in those lower centers. So you use something like specific pranayama breathing techniques to draw that energy up first to the heart, then to the throat, and then upwards to the wisdom centers in the third eye and the crown. And that's a practical process. You don't even have to believe in chakras or believe in energy centers or believe in any of the fucking woo-woo stuff. Sorry, I need to bleep that out. But you don't need to believe in any of that stuff to feel the impact of specific breathing techniques that will draw that energy up, and it will increase your physical and neurological energy because you're pulling yourself out of fear, and you start to see the world in a very, very different way. The other thing to do is to then work from the top, the brain. So one is working through those energy centers, drawing that energy up through, essentially, it's called the central canal. It's a tiny thin tube in your spinal column. The other thing to do is to work on the brain itself and to optimize the brain for all 5 of the brain waves: alpha, theta, delta, beta, and gamma. And that essentially is conditioning your frequency following response away from just latching on to fear, which means that when we do experience global times of fear or even local incidences of fear and sadness, we are able to recognize that for what it is and reckon you have this, like I said, you create this sensory perception of a non-sensory function. So you know I'm probably in a high beta brainwave right now. So it's the kind of the observer effect. I'm probably in a high beta brainwave now. I know exactly what I need to do to bring myself back to an alpha brainwave. And we have something called the neurotonic protocols, which is a 270 track, 90-day conditioning program. Essentially, it's 10-minute tracks, 3 tracks a day that will optimize the frequency following response. So you know exactly what to do to get back into an alpha state. So it's about having control over your energy systems. And you don't even need to worry about the mind. I would suggest that all the positive psychology work that we've done was the foundations for understanding it's temporary and it works in the moment, but doesn't work long term. So forget the mindset work. Draw energy up from the survival centers using specific breathing techniques and really start to gain control over your brain waves by optimizing the frequency following response and using things like the neurotonic protocols or magnetic resonance devices. We use transcranial direct stimulation, which is electrical currents. And you start understanding what brainwave is useful for what function in the manifesting process. And when we talk about manifesting, all we're really talking about is turning inspired ideas into income. And parts of that kind of journey from thought to intention to attention to action to realization, different brainwaves play a different role. So when you're thinking about something, you are wanting to be in a state where your brain is able to visualize the future. So you put yourself into an alpha state, which activates the visual cortex. Now your brain can see what that future looks like. You then move into the theta state, where you start rewriting the subconscious with new empowering beliefs about your ability to create that future. Then you start taking aligned action in the beta state, and that aligned, focused action means that you start creating, etc., etc., etc. So it's control over your energy systems, my own natural energy yield, and that comes from a physical, biophysical perspective and a neurological perspective. And then you don't need to worry about the psychology. And it can happen very, very quickly. You know, the breakthroughs that my people experience when they come to a one-day event or even a 2-hour, we did a 2-hour event last night for a couple of hundred people. And you because the biophysics and the neurology work so immediately, the breakthroughs happen very, very quickly. So it's not about enduring a long, drawn-out journey to try and fix the brain or fix the body in the same way that we've been trying to fix the mind. The impact is immediate when you start actually managing your energy levels.
I was going to add to that. I mean, the whole concept of psychology is that we aren't rationally making decisions, right? That's why you said at the beginning, we're not rational creatures. We're actually responding to the subconscious programming. And the whole point of psychology and going to a psychotherapist, for example, is actually to try and work out what that subconscious programming is and how it's controlling us by delving into our past and delving into all the memories and trying to talk about it, talk it all out. And so you're basically trying to work out what the subconscious programming is so that you can then think through it and then come back out again and work out why it's impacting your rational thinking and then say, no, this isn't right, it shouldn't impact that, and then kind of work through it that way. And what you're basically saying is, don't bother with all of that, just change the subconscious programming. Because if you change the energy sequences, you change the underlying energy frequency of everything, then the subconscious programming changes, and then it doesn't actually come up anymore. It doesn't rear its head and affect your consciousness in the same way, which means that you won't be having the same thoughts. So instead of you sitting there and coming out with some good rationalization for why you're not doing something and giving basically a load of what I think is self-sabotage crap comes out of your mouth, and people, the more fearful you are, the more irrational and illogical what comes out your mouth is. And it's amazing when you hear someone in a fear state trying to push away from something they've decided that isn't right for them, the stuff that they will say, it's like, but what, that doesn't make any sense. What have you just? I don't get it. It doesn't, and it also doesn't correlate with what they've said previously, because it's not meant to, because it's actually just the rational brain trying to come up with an excuse. But if you do what you've just said, you go through those processes, the rational brain doesn't have to try and come up with an excuse, because there is nothing underneath anymore trying to control you, because you've dealt with it. It's gone. And you've just dealt with it in a different route without having to try it with your rational brain. So
and then it becomes interesting to understand how the mind is working, because it's not immediately impacting your day-to-day actions. It's not impacting your vision for the future. So, when I start looking back at my ancestral past, and when I do, so we have a process, it's the regression, projection, integration process that we run at our retreats. And that is a combination of, essentially, we use yogic breathing, we use mudras, we use brainwave modulation, and we use waking state hypnosis to regress, project, and then integrate. And, even when I'm kind of doing those processes on myself, and things come up from my past, things come up from my ancestral past. I've had people going back to times, and this is going to sound completely off the wall. I've had people going back and remembering conversations that they heard. One lady in particular had a conversation in the womb. Her parents were having a conversation about what stroller they could or could not afford. Somebody else has gone back to a past life, and they were a cow with their teeth clamped. And again, all of this sounds nuts. And some of it might just be, I go back to my third year at junior school when something happened. But all of that becomes interesting context for understanding how the mind is trying to get you to do something. And again, it's the observer effect. So I'm not suggesting ignore it completely. I'm suggesting have the immediate impact of using your biophysics and your neurology to manage your day-to-day energy and your day-to-day turning inspired ideas into income. And then do the mind work, but come at that from a place, naturally, you come at that from a place of curiosity. And all of a sudden, it's like, okay, that's interesting. And it's interesting because it hasn't actually affected my day-to-day operations. It's interesting because I'm now beginning to get context of maybe the cycles I'm here to break, or maybe what used to impact me, but now I can see it as an observer rather than seeing it through the eyes of the person in the game, so to speak. And so it is about letting the brain and the body lead and the mind follow, and just stopping the mind being the weakest, loudest child on the playground that's trying to bully everybody else, but still trying to understand its behavior, still trying to understand its programming. Because, of course, if you don't understand the context, we can't break those cycles for future generations. And that's where all of this really goes to. Yes, we're talking about money. Yes, we're talking about self-actualization. Yes, we're talking about activating our fullest potential as spiritual beings in a material world, or you might think of yourself as a material being in a spiritual world, whichever. Yes, we're talking about all this stuff that's related to the self and that's inward looking. But ultimately, this is about going even a step further than self-actualization to the level of self-transcendence, where we transcend beyond the individual need. We transcend beyond what we want and what we need and what's important to us in this present moment. We start thinking about the whole. We start thinking about the one. We start thinking about universal consciousness, universal prosperity, rather than just individual prosperity. But we can't do that if we're fundamentally wired for fear, and if we're fundamentally worried about our own survival. And I guess just one closing thought, if it is a closing thought, we talk a lot about changing the economic system, and we talk a lot about how we want to move to a different form of capitalism, conscious capitalism, compassionate capitalism, whatever. And we thought Bitcoin, for example, might be the thing that would change the way that the economy, get rid of the central banks, decentralize the whole thing, et cetera, et cetera. And we thought Bitcoin was going to be the savior for our economy. But what happens is that the brain or the mind that is programmed for fear and greed starts playing the Bitcoin game through the filter of fear and greed. And all of a sudden it just becomes, if you look at Bitcoin on a chart, it follows exactly the same fear and greed patterns of, bounce, support and resistance, all this, the trading terminology follows the same patterns. You could be looking at any chart, a chart for oil, a chart for the dollar, a chart for coffee beans, any chart. Bitcoin follows the same patterns of fear and greed. And so if we really want to make a shift, if we really want to change the way that the human species evolves, then we have to start with the body and the brain, and we have to undo the physical and neurological programming that we are being enslaved by and shackled by. And that then changes the way that the species evolves. And we evolve as a species that operates through an abundance consciousness, not a scarcity consciousness. And that for me is the big, what I consider to be the big anthropological shift that will happen in the next 50, 100 years, if we get it right now, and if we change the way that we see the world as individuals and we see money as individuals.
Oh my God, how incredible is Dillon. What a powerful and inspirational human, with just such a wealth of conversation. We probably have a whole podcast just interviewing Dillon, to be honest. So I hope you took some inspiration and pearls of wisdom away from that conversation today. If you aren't already connected with Dillon, then please do. We will put some links in the show notes for where you can connect with Dillon on social media, or find out what he's doing in terms of the work to support you to create more abundance in your life. So please do reach out and connect with him and follow what he's up to, because he's an amazing person to have in your life. So thank you so much for joining us, Dillon. That's all for this week. So go and ponder that question. How can you create more abundance in your life through property, and just ultimately make the journey a whole lot more enjoyable? So until next week, have a fantastic week ahead.